The grand throne room of the Zerethian Empire was silent. King Vorketh, ruler of 1,000 worlds, sat on his golden throne, his sharp eyes filled with disappointment. Before him knelt his only daughter, Selara. She was small compared to her warrior brothers, her body weaker, her form less impressive. Zerethians were known for their strength, power, and dominance, but she had none of it. The king sighed heavily. "You are not fit to be my heir," he declared, his deep voice echoing through the hall. Selara did not respond. She had heard these words many times before. Since childhood, she had trained like her brothers, but no matter how hard she tried, she could never match their power. While they lifted massive weapons, she struggled. While they crushed enemies in battle, she barely survived. She had failed every test of strength, and now her father had decided her fate. The council of Zerethian generals watched with cold eyes. They were warriors who had conquered many planets, and to them, Selara was nothing but a weak link in their great empire. "Exile her," one of the generals suggested. "No," another said, shaking his head. "She is still of royal blood. She must be eliminated. We cannot let weakness exist in our lineage." Selara clenched her fists. She had trained, fought, and bled for this empire. Yet to them, she was worthless. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the side of the hall. "I will take her." The room turned toward the speaker. A human stood there, a tall man with short brown hair and sharp blue eyes. He wore a simple, battle-worn jacket, and a blaster pistol rested at his hip. His name was Captain Daniel Rains, a well-known mercenary who had worked with the Zerethians before. The king frowned. "A human," he said in disbelief. "What would you do with her?" Daniel shrugged. "I'll make something useful out of her." Laughter erupted in the hall. The idea of a weak princess being trained by a human was ridiculous. Zerethians saw humans as smaller, weaker beings, not warriors. One of the generals smirked. "Do you think a human can turn this failure into a fighter?" Daniel smiled. "Who knows? But if you're going to throw her away, why not give her to me?" The king leaned forward, his golden armor gleaming under the grand lights of the throne room. His expression was amused, but also curious. He had no interest in his daughter's fate anymore. "Fine," he said. "She is yours. Do what you want with her, but do not expect mercy if she returns as the weakling she is now." Daniel gave a small nod. "Deal." Selara looked up at him, confused. She had never met this human before, yet he had taken her away from certain death. She wasn't sure if he had saved her or simply delayed her fate. As Daniel walked toward her, he extended a hand. "Come on, princess. We've got work to do." Selara hesitated, then slowly took his hand. For the first time in her life, she was leaving the empire, not as a warrior, not as a princess, but as an exile. A new beginning. The journey to Daniel's ship was silent. Selara didn't speak, and Daniel didn't force her to. She sat in the co-pilot seat, staring at the stars as they left Zerethian space. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. Daniel glanced at her. "To a place where you'll learn how to survive." She frowned. "I've already trained my whole life." Daniel smirked. "No, you haven't. You've trained to be like your brothers. But strength alone doesn't make a warrior." Selara crossed her arms. She didn't believe him. Zerethians were strong. That was how they ruled. If she had been stronger, her father would have accepted her. That was all that mattered. But Daniel didn't argue. He simply piloted the ship toward his home, a planet called Vargas 9, known for its harsh conditions and dangerous creatures. It was a world where only the strong survived, but not through brute force. On this planet, survival required skill, intelligence, and adaptability. As they landed, Selara stepped outside and felt the heavy pull of gravity. The air was thicker than she was used to, and the ground beneath her feet was rough and uneven. Strange predators roamed the horizon, their glowing eyes watching from the shadows. Daniel stepped beside her. "Welcome to your new home." Silara clenched her fists. She didn't want to be here. She wanted to prove herself to her father. She wanted to be strong. But now, she had no choice. For the first time in her life, she had to fight. Not to impress her father, not to earn the respect of her people, but to survive. And for the first time, she was truly alone. Silara stood on the rocky surface of Vargas 9, her eyes scanning the dark, storm-filled sky. The gravity was heavier than what she was used to, making every step feel like she was carrying extra weight. The air was thick, filled with the scent of damp earth and wild creatures hiding in the shadows. Daniel Rains watched her from a few steps away, his arms crossed. "This isn't your empire, princess. Strength alone won't save you here." Silara narrowed her eyes. "I've trained all my life. Just tell me what to do." Daniel smirked. "All right. Survive." Before she could ask what he meant, he suddenly pulled a knife from his belt and threw it at her feet. "You have 3 days. No food, no water, no help. Find your own way back to camp." Silara stared at him in disbelief. "Are you insane?" Daniel shrugged. "You think you're strong? Then prove it." He turned and walked back toward the camp, leaving her alone in the wild. Silara's heart pounded. She had trained in royal battlefields, in the best facilities her empire had, but she had never been alone like this. She glanced around, gripping the knife tightly. 3 days. She had to find food, water, and shelter. She had to survive. The wild awakens. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The warmth of the day disappeared, and now the wind carried a freezing bite. Silara wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. She knew she had to find shelter before she froze to death. She searched the area, her feet unsteady on the rough terrain. After what felt like hours, she found a small cave. It wasn't much, but at least it would keep her out of the cold. She stepped inside cautiously, her knife ready. The air smelled damp and stale, and something about the darkness inside made her uneasy. Then she heard it. A low growl echoed from the depths of the cave. Silara froze. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stay still. Her people had always told her that fear was weakness, but now she realized that fear could also keep her alive. Slowly, she backed away from the entrance. A shadow moved inside. Then, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the darkness. A Vargas beast. Silara's breath caught in her throat. She had read about them. Fast, deadly hunters with razor-sharp claws and unmatched speed. It was the apex predator of this planet. She turned and ran. The beast roared and charged after her. A desperate fight. Silara's feet pounded against the rocky ground, her lungs burning from the effort. She could hear the beast gaining on her, its claws scraping against the earth. If it caught her, she was dead. She needed a plan. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything she could use. Then she spotted a large tree with thick roots. She sprinted toward it, and at the last moment, jumped, grabbing onto a low branch and pulling herself up. The beast slammed into the tree, roaring in frustration. It clawed at the bark, trying to climb, but its massive body made it slow. Silara's hands trembled as she gripped her knife. This was her chance. If she ran again, it would catch her. She had to fight. Taking a deep breath, she leaped from the tree, aiming straight for the beast's back. Her knife plunged into its thick hide, but the creature screamed in rage and thrashed violently, throwing her off. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her body. The beast turned toward her, furious. Silara gritted her teeth. "Come on," she shouted, raising her knife. The beast charged. At the last moment, she dropped to the side, rolling across the ground as the creature slammed into a sharp rock formation. It howled in pain, its side bleeding from the impact. Silara didn't hesitate. She jumped onto its back again, and this time stabbed deep into its neck. The beast let out one final roar before it collapsed. Silara gasped for breath. her whole body aching. But she had done it. She had won. She had survived. Daniel watches. From a distance, Daniel watched through his binoculars, a small smirk on his face. He had known Xilara would struggle, but he also knew she had something her people never saw in her: determination. He turned away and walked back to camp. The real training was only just beginning. Xilara stumbled into the camp just as the first light of dawn painted the sky. Her body was covered in dirt, bruises, and dried blood, but her grip on the knife remained firm. Her legs felt like they would give out at any moment. Yet she refused to fall. Daniel sat near the campfire, casually sharpening a long hunting knife. He didn't look surprised to see her. Instead, he glanced at her injuries and smirked. 3 days. Not bad. Xilara took a shaky breath. You left me to die. Daniel shrugged. If you had died, then you weren't ready to be a warrior. Her fists clenched, anger burning inside her. You think this proves something? She growled. I fought a Vargas beast and survived. I don't need your training. Daniel chuckled, standing up. Oh, you think you're a warrior now? His eyes locked onto hers, cold and sharp. Surviving one fight doesn't make you strong. It just means you got lucky. Xilara's pride flared, but before she could respond, Daniel moved. Fast. Before she even realized what was happening, she felt a sharp force slam into her stomach. She gasped as the air was knocked out of her. And the next second, she was on the ground, her knife flying from her grip. Daniel stood over her, arms crossed. See, luck won't save you in a real fight. Xilara groaned and pushed herself up, rage in her eyes. That wasn't fair. Daniel smirked. Neither is war. The first lesson. Xilara's body ached, but she forced herself to stand. She had survived the wilderness, killed a beast with her own hands. She wasn't going to back down now. Daniel tossed her a wooden training sword. All right, princess. Time to learn how to fight for real. She caught the weapon, gripping it tightly. I already know how to fight. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Oh, then come at me. Without hesitation, Xilara lunged. Her speed was impressive, and she swung the wooden sword with all her strength. But Daniel sidestepped easily. Before she could recover, she felt a sharp tap on her back. She stumbled forward. Daniel shook his head. Too slow. Xilara gritted her teeth and turned, striking again. Again, he dodged. Again, he countered. Every time she attacked, he was already gone, moving like a shadow, calm, patient, effortless. And every time he countered, his hits were precise, not strong enough to injure her but enough to make her feel weak. After only a few minutes, she was on the ground again, panting. Daniel crouched beside her, resting his arm on his knee. What did you learn? Xilara glared at him. That you enjoy humiliating me. He smirked. No, you learned that strength isn't everything. A real warrior doesn't just fight harder. They fight smarter. She didn't respond, but his words dug into her mind. Strength alone wasn't enough. A new way of thinking. The sun rose higher as they continued training. Daniel didn't let her rest. He taught her how to control her breathing, how to read an opponent's movements, and how to predict attacks before they came. Fighting isn't about being the strongest. It's about outthinking your enemy. He demonstrated, moving with perfect precision, his attacks flowing like water. Every movement had purpose, every strike had intent. Xilara tried again. She watched his stance, his balance. When he moved, she reacted, not with blind force, but with calculated movement. For the first time, she dodged his attack. Daniel grinned. Now you're getting it. The challenge. By evening, Xilara was exhausted, her muscles burning, but she refused to stop. Daniel studied her, then finally nodded. All right, princess. One last challenge. He grabbed a blindfold and tossed it to her. Xilara frowned. What is this? Put it on, Daniel ordered. She hesitated, but did as he said. The world turned black. Now fight me. Her heart pounded. How am I supposed to fight if I can't see? Daniel's voice was calm. Because your eyes aren't your only weapon. She gripped the wooden sword, listening. The wind shifted. A footstep on the ground. A faint breath. Then, movement. She turned instinctively, raising her weapon. A sharp crack echoed as her sword met Daniel's strike. She had blocked it. For the first time since training began, Daniel looked impressed. Silara took off the blindfold, breathing hard. Daniel smirked. Not bad. Princess. For the first time, Silara allowed herself a small smile. Not bad at all. But deep inside, she knew this was just the beginning. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh leaves. Silara stood in the middle of the clearing, gripping the wooden training sword tightly. Her arms ached from the last few days of relentless training, but she refused to show weakness. Daniel stood across from her, arms crossed. You've improved, but now it's time for the real test. Silara frowned. Another challenge. Daniel smirked and whistled sharply. From the edge of the camp, a large alien warrior stepped forward. His name was Orvac, a veteran soldier with thick gray skin, sharp tusks, and burning yellow eyes. He was at least twice Silara's size, and his muscles rippled with power. Silara's breath caught in her throat. Daniel gestured to Orvac. You're going to fight him. Silara stiffened. What? He's an elite soldier. Daniel nodded. Exactly. If you want to be strong, you have to fight strong opponents. Orvac cracked his knuckles and grinned. I won't go easy on her, human. Daniel shrugged. I wouldn't want you to. He turned to Silara. Remember your training. Fight smart. Silara swallowed hard, gripping her sword. This was real. The battle begins. Orvac moved first. He charged like a beast, his massive fists swinging toward her. Silara barely dodged, rolling to the side as his blow shattered the ground where she had been standing. She didn't have time to think, only react. She swung her sword, aiming for his ribs, but Orvac was fast. He blocked with his forearm and sent a powerful kick toward her. Silara leaped back, avoiding the impact by inches. Daniel's voice rang out. You're still thinking like a noble. Fight like a warrior. Silara gritted her teeth. She was used to training with structured moves and controlled fights, but this was different. This was survival. She took a deep breath, focusing. What had Daniel taught her? Don't rely on strength. Outsmart your enemy. Turning the tide. Orvac charged again, swinging his arm like a hammer. But this time, Silara didn't dodge back. Instead, she stepped forward, ducking under his arm. She used his own momentum against him, slamming the hilt of her sword into his side. Orvac grunted in surprise. Daniel grinned. Better. Silara didn't stop. She circled him, striking at his legs and ribs, forcing him to defend. She wasn't stronger, but she was faster. Orvac snarled and threw a wild punch. Silara sidestepped and struck his knee. Hard. He stumbled. Her heart pounded. She could win this. A warrior's will. Orvac growled and stood tall again. Enough games. Before Silara could react, he lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. Pain shot through her arm as she was lifted off the ground and thrown across the clearing. She crashed against a tree, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. She gasped, trying to get up. Daniel's voice was sharp. Get up, Silara. A warrior doesn't stay down. Silara clenched her fists. No, she wouldn't lose. She forced herself to stand, her body screaming in protest. Orvac smirked, expecting her to surrender. But instead, Silara closed her eyes. She listened. The wind, the movement of his feet on the ground, the shift in the air before his attack. When Orvac lunged again, Silara moved before he did. She ducked, twisted, and drove her wooden sword straight into his stomach. Orvac froze, eyes wide. Then he fell to his knees. Silence filled the camp. Victory. Scifi panted, gripping her sword tightly. She had won. Daniel stepped forward, nodding with approval. Now you're fighting like a warrior. Orvac looked up at her, rubbing his sore ribs. You are strong, princess, not because of your power, but because of your mind. Scifi didn't smile. She simply nodded, finally understanding. Strength alone was not enough. A true warrior knew how to think, adapt, and never give up. Daniel clapped his hands. Good, because your real test starts tomorrow. Scifi blinked. That wasn't the real test. Daniel grinned. No, that was just practice. Her stomach sank, but she held her sword tighter. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. The sky was still dark when Daniel woke Scifi. A cold wind blew through the camp, rustling the trees. Scifi groaned and sat up, her body aching from the fight with Orvac the previous day. Already? She mumbled, rubbing her sore arms. Daniel stood over her, arms crossed. Real battles don't wait for you to be ready. Scifi sighed but got to her feet. She was exhausted, but she knew there was no point in arguing. She had come too far to quit now. Daniel led her to the center of the camp, where Orvac and a few other warriors stood waiting. A large wooden chest sat on the ground between them. Scifi frowned. What's in the box? She asked. Daniel smirked and opened the lid. Inside lay a heavy set of armor and a real sword, not the wooden one she had been training with. The blade gleamed in the morning light, sharp and deadly. This is your next challenge, Daniel said. You're going on a real mission. Scifi blinked. A mission? Orvac nodded. We received news of a raider camp nearby. They have been attacking travelers and stealing supplies. You will go there and deal with them. Scifi's heart pounded. This wasn't training. This was real. Alone? She asked. Daniel shook his head. No. I'll go with you, but this is your test. You will lead. She swallowed hard but nodded. She wouldn't back down. The journey begins. The sun rose as they set out through the forest. Scifi wore the new armor, feeling its weight with every step. It was different from the fine ceremonial robes she once wore in her father's palace. This was the armor of a warrior. Daniel walked beside her, his own sword strapped to his back. Orvac and two other fighters followed behind, silent but watchful. How many raiders are there? Scifi asked. We don't know, Orvac said. Maybe 5, maybe 10. She took a deep breath. She had to be ready for anything. The raider camp. By midday, they reached the edge of the raiders' territory. From their hiding spot in the trees, Scifi saw a small camp with 5 tents and a wooden fence. Smoke rose from a fire pit where a few alien raiders sat, laughing and eating. She studied their movements. They're not expecting an attack, she whispered. Daniel nodded. That's to our advantage. What's your plan? She hesitated. She had never led a real battle before. But she thought of everything Daniel had taught her. A direct attack is too risky, she said. We should be smart. She turned to Orvac. You and the others circle around. Attack from the back when I give the signal. Orvac grinned. Good plan. She turned to Daniel. We'll take the front. If we catch them off guard, they won't know where to defend. Daniel smiled. Now you're thinking like a warrior. The attack. Scifi gripped her sword, steadying her breath. This was it. She and Daniel crept forward, staying low in the tall grass. The raiders still hadn't noticed them. Now, Scifi leaped forward, sword flashing. Her blade sliced through the wooden fence, sending shards flying. The raiders jumped up in shock. Before they could react, Scifi charged. She blocked the first raider's strike and countered, slamming the hilt of her sword into his stomach. He collapsed with a groan. Daniel was beside her, moving like a blur. His sword clashed against an enemy's blade, sparks flying. From the other side of the camp, A loud battle cry rang out. Orvac and the others rushed in, attacking from behind. The raiders panicked. Silara's heart pounded as she fought. She dodged, countered, and struck with precision. She wasn't the weak girl she had been before. One of the raiders lunged at her with a dagger. Silara sidestepped and knocked the blade from his hands. She grabbed his arm and twisted, sending him crashing to the ground. Within minutes, the fight was over. The raiders who weren't defeated fled into the forest, terrified. Silara panted, sword still raised. She had won. A warrior's pride. Orvac laughed, clapping a hand on Silara's shoulder. You fought well, princess. Daniel smirked. Not bad. Silara felt a rush of pride. This was the first time she had truly led a fight, and she had succeeded. But as she looked at the fallen raiders, she felt something else. This wasn't a game. These were real enemies, real fights. She turned to Daniel. What happens now? Daniel's expression was serious. Now you decide what kind of warrior you want to be. Silara understood. Strength wasn't just about winning fights. It was about knowing when to fight and when to stop. She sheathed her sword. She was no longer just the weak daughter of a king. She was a warrior. The sun was beginning to set as Silara and her team returned to camp. Her body ached from the battle, but there was something new in her heart. Pride. She had led her first mission, faced real danger, and emerged victorious. Yet, she knew this was only the beginning. Daniel walked beside her, silent as always, but there was a slight nod of approval in his eyes. Orvac and the other warriors followed behind, carrying the supplies they had reclaimed from the raiders. As they approached the camp, an uneasy feeling settled in Silara's chest. Something was wrong. The camp was too quiet. She tightened her grip on her sword as she stepped forward. Suddenly, a shadow moved near the trees. Then another. Silara's breath caught in her throat. They were not alone. Ambush. Before she could react, an arrow whizzed past her head, barely missing her. Attack. Someone shouted from the trees. More arrows rained down, forcing them to take cover. Dark figures emerged from the forest, taller, stronger-looking warriors, their armor glinting in the fading sunlight. These weren't ordinary raiders. They were trained soldiers. Orvac cursed. This is bad. These aren't just bandits. Daniel's expression hardened. They must have been watching us, waiting for us to get tired. Silara gritted her teeth. She wouldn't let fear take over. Then we fight. Daniel smirked. That's the spirit. Holding the line. The enemy soldiers charged forward, swords raised. Silara blocked the first strike, her arms straining under the weight of the blow. These enemies were stronger than the raiders. She twisted, using her opponent's momentum against him, and knocked him off balance. Before he could recover, she slammed her fist into his jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. Daniel was a blur of motion, taking down enemies with precise, deadly strikes. Orvac and the others fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered. Silara's heart pounded. If they didn't do something fast, they would be overwhelmed. Then she spotted something, a ridge above the battlefield. An idea sparked in her mind. Daniel, we need to draw them to that ridge. Daniel glanced at it and nodded. He didn't need an explanation. Fall back. Everyone, retreat toward the ridge, he shouted. At first, the enemy soldiers thought they were winning. But as they chased after the retreating warriors, they didn't notice the terrain changing beneath their feet. Silara and her team reached the ridge first, positioning themselves at the top. When the enemy soldiers finally realized where they were, it was too late. Silara raised her sword high. Now, push them back. The warriors at the top struck downward with their weapons, using the high ground to their advantage. The enemy soldiers struggled to fight uphill, their movements slowed by the uneven ground. The tide of battle shifted. Within minutes, the enemy soldiers began to retreat. They had won. The truth revealed. As the dust settled, Silara surveyed the battlefield. Bodies of enemy soldiers lay scattered across the ridge. Orvac wiped sweat from his forehead. That was too close. Daniel frowned. These weren't just random attackers. They were organized, trained. Silara crouched beside one of the fallen enemies and pulled back his helmet. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized the markings on his armor. These were royal soldiers, soldiers from her father's kingdom. Her mind raced. Why would her father's men attack her? Then it hit her. Her father must have learned about her training, and he saw it as a threat. Daniel seemed to understand as well. His voice was calm but serious. Your father doesn't want you to become strong. Silara's hands clenched into fists. She had spent her whole life trying to prove herself to her father, trying to earn his respect. And now he had sent his own soldiers to stop her. A cold determination settled in her heart. If her father thought she would give up, he was wrong. A warrior's choice. That night, as the warriors sat around the fire, Silara sat apart from the others, staring at the flames. Daniel approached and sat beside her. What's on your mind? She took a deep breath. I always thought my father wanted me to be strong. But now, I see he only wanted me to be obedient. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said, strength isn't just about fighting. It's about choosing your own path. You have to decide what kind of warrior you want to be. Silara looked up at him, her eyes filled with resolve. She had made her decision. She would not return to the palace as a weak, forgotten princess. She would rise as a warrior, a leader, and she would show her father that she was stronger than he ever imagined. The morning sun painted the sky with streaks of orange and gold. Silara stood at the edge of the battlefield, staring at the distant palace where her father ruled. Her hands tightened around the hilt of her sword. She had come too far to stop now. Daniel stood beside her, silent but watchful. Orvac and the other warriors gathered behind them, their weapons ready. They were not just rebels anymore. They were an army. A storm was coming. The palace gates. Silara led her warriors through the city streets. People whispered as they passed, some in awe, some in fear. She had once walked these streets as a weak princess, ignored and forgotten. Now, she returned as a warrior. As they reached the palace gates, they were met with a wall of royal soldiers. Her father had been expecting her. A familiar figure stepped forward. General Kador, her father's most loyal commander. His eyes were cold as he spoke. Turn back, princess. This is not your place. Silara took a step forward, her voice steady. It is now. Kador sighed. You were never meant to fight. Your father wanted to keep you safe. She clenched her fists. Safe. He sent assassins after me. Kador hesitated, then nodded. He feared what you were becoming. Silara's heart burned with anger. Then he was right to fear me. She raised her sword. I challenge my father. Let him face me himself. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. A challenge before the throne could not be ignored. Kador sighed again. Very well. But do not expect mercy. The gates opened, facing the king. The throne room was just as she remembered. Grand, cold, unwelcoming. At the far end, sitting upon the high throne, was the alien king, her father. His eyes narrowed as she entered. You dare to return. Silara held her ground. I am not here to beg. I am here to fight. Her father's lips curled into a smirk. You think you are strong now. Stronger than me. She met his gaze without fear. I don't think. I know. The king rose from his throne. His massive frame cast a shadow across the hall. Then prove it. Father versus daughter. The battle began with a single strike. The king moved first, his blade slicing through the air. Silara barely dodged in time. He was fast. Faster than she had expected. He attacked again, his strength overwhelming. Every strike forced her backward. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind. Had she come all this way just to fail? Then she remembered Daniel's words. Strength isn't just about fighting. It's about choosing your own path. She gritted her teeth. She was not that weak princess anymore. She shifted her stance, dodging instead of blocking, countering instead of retreating. The king frowned. She was adapting, learning. He swung his blade in a wide arc, aiming to finish her, but she was already moving. With a swift roll, she dodged beneath his strike and slammed her sword against his armor. The impact sent him stumbling. The throne room fell silent. For the first time, the king looked, uncertain. The last blow. Her father roared and charged again, but Scifi saw his mistake. He was relying on power. She was relying on skill. She sidestepped at the last moment and struck his exposed side. The king gasped as he fell to one knee. His sword clattered to the ground. Scifi stood over him, her sword pointed at his chest. The room held its breath. She had won, but she did not strike the final blow. Instead, she stepped back. I don't need to kill you to prove I'm stronger. Her father looked up at her, eyes filled with something she had never seen before. Respect. A new era. The warriors and nobles watching the battle fell to their knees. They knew the truth now. The old rule had ended. A new leader had risen. Scifi turned to her people. No more weakness. No more fear. We will rise together. The throne room erupted into cheers. Daniel smirked from the sidelines. Told you. She laughed, for the first time in years. The forgotten princess was gone. A mighty warrior had taken her place.